Some of the weirdest tractors in American history were built over 100 years ago, and most of them look nothing like a tractor. From bug-shaped single cylinders to diesel beasts with tank tracks and no front wheels. These tractors changed farming in ways no one expected. Here are the 17 weirdest American tractors you've never heard of. And trust me, number 14 looked more like a car than a tractor. 1. Gray 1836. The Gray 18-36 was a super unique-looking tractor made way back in 1916 by the Gray Tractor Company in Minnesota. What made it really stand out was its massive back wheel. But get this, it didn't even have regular wheels like most tractors. Instead, it had this giant drum in the back, about 54 inches wide. Imagine a huge metal rolling pin pushing the tractor forward. That single rear drum helped it grip the ground way better, especially in muddy or loose soil where other tractors would probably get stuck. Another cool thing about the Gray 1836 is how the engine was placed sideways, or what they call cross-mounted. That was pretty rare back then and helped with balance and power transfer. It was also the first tractor to go through the Nebraska tractor tests that burned gasoline and used that special drum design. That test made it kind of famous because it proved that its weird design actually worked. Even though it looked strange and probably made people scratch their heads at first, it was a smart solution for farmers who needed a machine that could work through tough ground. Over time, though, the big drum design didn't catch on like normal wheels did, but it still deserves credit for being one of the first to try something totally different and making it work. 2. Bates Steel Mule. The Bates Steel Mule Model D is one of those tractors that really looked odd even back in the early 1900s. Built around 1913 by the Joliet Oil Tractor Company in Illinois, this tractor wasn't like the normal four-wheeled tractors you might imagine. It had two big steel wheels in the front and in the back. Not wheels, just one long crawler track, kind of like what tanks use. That's why people call it a half-track tractor. The idea behind this strange design was actually pretty smart. It was built to help farmers who worked on really soft or muddy land. The crawler track gave it better grip and spread out the tractor's weight so it didn't sink. That way, farmers could use it instead of horses, even in places where regular tractors would just get stuck. It was also marketed as a lightweight machine that could pull normal horse-drawn tools, like plows and seeders. Basically, it was trying to be a bridge between using animals and switching to full-on machines. And even though it didn't become super popular, it still made a big impact. Honestly, the Bates Steel Mule looked a little weird, but it worked. 3. Bates Steel Mule Model D. The Little Bull tractor was built in 1914 by the Bull Tractor Company in Minnesota. It had a super odd three-wheel design, one giant wheel in the back that did all the driving, a much smaller wheel also in the back for balance, and one front wheel for steering. It kind of looked like a bull's nose from the front, which is probably how it got its name. The whole point of the Little Bull was to be cheap and simple. Back then, big tractors were really expensive, and not every farmer could afford one. So the company made this smaller, lightweight version that was meant to be easier to use and way more affordable. It was so light that one person could easily move it around or even pull it out of a ditch if it got stuck. One unusual part of its design was a leveling rod that helped keep the tractor from tipping over. Since it was basically riding on three weirdly placed wheels, tipping was a real risk, especially on uneven ground. The rod gave it some balance, but still, it wasn't the most stable thing in the world. Even though the design was kind of awkward, it actually sold pretty well for a while because of the price. But eventually, better four-wheel tractors took over. But next up is a tiny devilish machine, literally called the Little Devil. 4. Hart-Parr Little Devil. The Hart-Parr Little Devil is probably one of the strangest early tractors ever made. It came out way back in 1902, and the name Little Devil fits it perfectly. First of all, it was super small for a tractor with just 22 horsepower. That doesn't sound like much today, but back then it was still pretty impressive. What made it stand out, though, was its funky design. It had one big wheel at the back that drove the whole thing and two smaller front wheels that steered it. That setup is called a tricycle layout, and it looked more like a giant mechanical bug than a farm machine. The engine was also kind of wild. It was a single-cylinder two-stroke engine, which was already different from what most other tractors used. And get this, it could actually stall and then reverse itself without needing the driver to shift gears. That's like your car turning itself around if it stopped running. It was kind of cool, but also kind of chaotic. Because it was small and sat low to the ground, it was easy to use in small spaces or near crops. But the weird engine and layout made it hard to handle. Most farmers didn't love it. Eventually, a lot of the little devils were taken back or just stopped being used altogether. Not many survived. 5. Samson Sieve Grip. The Samson Sieve Grip tractor was one of the weirdest looking tractors General Motors ever got involved with. Yeah, that's right. GM owned the company that made this thing. It wasn't built to be pretty, but it sure worked in places where normal tractors got stuck. It was mostly used in orchards and on soft, swampy land. That's because instead of regular tires or even solid rubber ones, it had these crazy steel wheels with open holes and big metal cleats. The pattern looked kind of like a sieve, which is how it got the name Sieve Grip. These wheels didn't just look wild, they gave the tractor insane grip on loose dirt, sand, or swampy ground. Since the holes in the wheels let mud and stuff fall through, the wheels didn't get clogged like rubber tires sometimes do. That made it super handy for tough jobs, especially when pulling equipment through peat fields or soggy areas. GM really hyped up the design and said it could go places other tractors couldn't. It wasn't fast and it wasn't smooth, but it didn't need to be. It just needed to pull stuff and not get stuck, and it nailed that. It was definitely a workhorse, not a beauty. Queen. Farmers who needed a machine that could handle extreme ground loved it, but it wasn't really built for everyday field work. 6. Bullock Creeping Grip 12 to 20. The Bullock Creeping Grip 12 to 20 was a super odd tractor made in 1916 in Chicago. First off, it didn't even have front wheels. Yeah, none at all. Instead, it had two long steel tracks, kind of like tank tracks, and that's how it moved. But what really made it strange was the way you had to steer it. Since there were no front wheels, the driver had to use a system of brakes and clutches on the tracks. If you wanted to turn left, you pressed a foot pedal to stop the left track. The right side would keep moving, and boom, it would turn. Kinda cool, kinda complicated. This steering method is called differential steering, and it was way ahead of its time. You could even make the tractor spin in place by locking one track and running the other. That made it super helpful in tight spots, like inside barns or orchards where space was limited. The whole tractor had a low, wide body, which helped with stability and made it look like a beast crawling across the ground. It was especially useful on soft soil or uneven land where wheeled tractors would tip or get stuck. But the whole foot pedal thing wasn't for everyone. It took a bit of skill to drive it smoothly, and it probably felt more like riding a machine from the future than a regular farm tractor. But coming up is a bug-shaped tractor with its engine in the back. Allis-Chalmers Model G. The Allis-Chalmers Model G was a super weird-looking little tractor made between 1948 and 1955. It was built for small farms, especially vegetable farms, and if you've ever seen one, you'll know it doesn't look like your typical tractor. That's because the engine was placed at the very back instead of the front. Most tractors have their engines up front, but this one put it behind the seat. That made the front of the tractor totally open, which was great for one specific reason. Tools and attachments could be mounted underneath where the driver could see them clearly. This setup was super helpful when planting, weeding, or doing precise row crop work. Farmers could just look down and see exactly what the tool was doing. The Model G had a Continental engine that gave it about 9 horsepower. Not very powerful by today's standards, but good enough for small farms. It also had a narrow body and sometimes came with just one front wheel instead of two. That helped it squeeze through narrow crop rows without crushing anything. Honestly, it looked kind of like a bug from the side. 8. BF Avery Model A. The BF Avery Model A was a small but unusual tractor that stood out mainly because of its tricycle setup. Built between 1943 and 1950, it came from a company in Kentucky and was originally based on a design from another brand called Cletrac. What made it different was its layout. It had just one wheel in the front and two in the back. That might sound unstable, but it actually helped it make super tight turns, which is great for farming between narrow rows of crops. This tractor was especially helpful for row crop farming, like growing corn or sugarcane, because the front wheel could easily fit between rows without damaging the plants. Some people even used it for cane plowing. It was simple, reliable, and just strong enough to handle the basic farm jobs. The Model A didn't have a fancy engine or high-tech parts. It was all about function. Farmers liked it because it was easy to maintain and did what it was supposed to do. And because it was smaller and lighter, it used less fuel and didn't sink into soft ground as easily as bigger tractors did. One of the coolest things is how this tractor could work with older horse-drawn equipment. You didn't have to buy a ton of new tools to use it. Just hook up what you already had, and off you go. But the next one? It looked like a metal skeleton on 3 wheels. 9. Boring tractor. Okay, so the boring tractor might sound, well, boring. But the truth is, it was anything but. This thing was built for just 1 year between 1921 and 1922 by a company in Rockford, Illinois, and it looked super weird. It had only 3 wheels, one skinny wheel in the front for steering, and 2 large spoked wheels in the back for power. And instead of looking like a regular tractor with a big, bulky body, it had a long, narrow frame that kind of looked like a metal skeleton. It was advertised as a carrying tractor, which basically meant it was made to carry plows and other tools directly on its frame. The farmer would sit on this long, thin structure while the tractor did the work, which must have felt kind of like riding a giant tricycle through the field. It was designed to be lightweight and simple, so it could handle cultivating and planting without crushing crops or getting stuck. Unfortunately, not many people bought it, and it never became popular. Only a few were ever made, and today it's considered super rare. There's barely any info out there about it, and most of what we know comes from old dealer brochures and 1 or 2 photos. 10. Avery Rowtrac. The Avery Rowtrac is one of those tractors that looks normal at first, but once you learn how it works, it's actually pretty awesome. It was made from 1938 to 1942 by the Avery Farm Equipment Company in Illinois. What made it special was its funky front wheel system. Most tractors had either a narrow or wide front axle, and you had to pick one or the other. But with the Rowtrac, you got both in one. The front wheels were mounted on pivoting arms, so you could actually switch from a narrow front to a wide front in just about 30 minutes. That's wild, right? Narrow mode helped with row crop farming because it could fit between plants, and wide mode gave more balance and stability. So it was kind of like a tractor with a hidden superpower. It also came with a 6-cylinder Hercules engine, so it had a lot of power for a tractor of its size. But even though it was strong and flexible, it didn't sell very well. The fancy suspension system it used, with spring-loaded tubes instead of a normal axle, caused some problems. The steering and drivetrain didn't always hold up under tough work, and that made farmers a little cautious. 11. Fagioli 9-12 Walking Tractor. The Fagioli 9-12, also known as the walking tractor, was honestly one of the strangest tractors ever made. It came out in 1917 and was built in California, mainly for farmers working in orchards and vineyards. Back then, tractors would often get stuck in soft dirt, especially in places with loose soil. So the people at Fagioli came up with a crazy idea. Why not make a tractor that walks? And no, it didn't have legs or anything, but it did have spiked wheels that kind of acted like legs. Each wheel had triangle-shaped metal spikes called grousers sticking out of the rim. As the tractor moved, These spikes would dig into the ground and lift the wheel a bit, making the tractor sort of hop or walk instead of roll. It was a weird sight, but it actually worked pretty well in super soft ground. The whole thing weighed around 3,500 pounds, which isn't that much for a tractor. It was designed to be small and light so it wouldn't crush crops or sink into the soil. But even though it was clever, it was also really expensive to make and kind of complicated to keep running. Because of that, people slowly stopped using it by the 1930s. But the next one? It was 2 tractors in one. And yes, it was called the Do-All. Advanced Rumilly Do-All. The Advanced Rumilly Do-All was kind of like the Swiss Army knife of tractors back in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Made in LaPorte, Indiana, this machine was designed to be 2 tractors in one. That's not just a catchy slogan, it actually had a frame and front-end setup that could switch between 2 different styles. One setup was for regular farming, wide 4-wheel layout, and the other was a tricycle-style layout that helped with tight row crop work. Farmers could basically swap out the front axle and wheels depending on what they needed to do. That was a big deal because tractors were expensive, and most farmers couldn't afford to buy a different one for each job. The Do-All helped solve that by being super flexible. It had a Waukesha 4-cylinder engine that gave it about 20 horsepower on the belt and around 16 horsepower for pulling. That might not sound like much today, but for the time, it was solid power packed into a compact frame. It only had 2 gears, so it wasn't fast, but it got the job done. The driver sat out in the open, no cab or roof, so rain and dust were part of the deal. Around 3,000 of these were made, so it's not crazy rare, but it's definitely a cool piece for collectors today. 13. Minneapolis Moline UDLX Comfort Tractor. The Minneapolis Moline UDLX, better known as the Comfort Tractor, is probably one of the strangest but coolest ideas in tractor history. It came out in 1938 and was basically a tractor that looked like a car. No joke. MM took one of their universal tractors and added a fully enclosed metal cab with windows, doors, lights, and even a heater. It looked more like an old-timey delivery van than something meant to work in a field. The whole idea behind it was to give farmers a machine they could use during the day on the farm and then drive into town at night. Yep, it had fenders, headlights, and a comfy seat. You could plow your field, clean it up, and then drive it straight into the city like a regular car. That's why they called it the Comfort Tractor, a mix of comfort and tractor. But here's the catch. Nobody really bought it. Farmers thought it was too fancy and too expensive, especially during the Great Depression. Plus, let's be honest, most people didn't care if their tractor looked stylish, they just wanted it to work. So, the Comfort Tractor ended up being more of a showpiece than something people actually used on a daily basis. Only a few prototypes and demo models were ever built, and they were mostly used for marketing. 14. International Harvester 2+2 Series. The International Harvester 2+2 Series was a funky-looking tractor family that came out between 1979 and 1984. The whole point of this design was to give farmers the power of a 4-wheel drive tractor, but still keep the ability to do tight turns and row crop farming. And yeah, it looked weird, but it was built for serious work. What made it stand out was the way it was split into 2 parts. The front and back were connected by a joint that let it bend in the middle, kind of like a snake. The engine wasn't in the middle like most tractors. It was actually all the way up front, ahead of the front axle. That helped with balance and gave better traction when pulling stuff behind it. This 2+2 layout meant it had 4 big drive wheels, but it didn't behave like a clunky, full-size 4D tractor. It could turn in tight spaces with a turning radius of just over 15 feet, which is really good for something that big. When it turned, the back end stayed straight, so it worked really well with rear attachments. Farmers had mixed opinions about the 2+2 when it first came out. Some loved the design and how it handled, while others thought it was just too different. But over time, it gained a loyal fan base because it was tough, reliable, and handled row crops better than most big tractors. 15. Allis-Chalmers Model 612. The Allis-Chalmers Model 612 was one of the weirdest tractors ever made, especially for its time. Built between 1918 and 1923, it was called a two-wheel tractor, but it kind of cheated a little. It only had two actual driving wheels, and instead of having a full rear axle like normal tractors, it used the thing you attach to it, like a plow or a cart, to act as the back wheels. Yeah, that's right. The farmer would sit on the attachment behind the tractor, not on the tractor itself. The front of the machine had the engine and the power, and the back part, your plow or whatever you were using, basically held everything together and helped it balance. It was like a tractor, and its attachment had to work as one team or nothing would work at all. The engine was just 6 horsepower, so it wasn't very strong, but it got the job done on small farms. This design was supposed to save money and make it easier for farmers to switch from horses to machines, and in some ways it worked. It was light, cheap, and didn't take up much space. But you needed special tools made just for this setup, which made it a bit of a hassle. Eventually, full-size 4-wheel tractors came out that were easier to use and didn't need weird attachments to stand up. 16. Bates Steel Mule. The Bates Steel Mule might have one of the coolest tractor names ever, and its design was just as bold. It was made sometime between 1913 and 1920 by the Joliet Oil Tractor Company in Illinois, and it didn't look like anything else on the market. The front had 2 big steel wheels, like regular tractors, but the back? Instead of wheels, it had one long steel track, kind of like a tank. That made it what people call a half-track tractor. This thing was made to take over the job of horses on farms. The idea was that it could pull all the same tools and wagons that horses did, but with more power and less effort. The front wheels gave it some steering and helped it float over soft ground, while the crawler track in the back gave it major traction. That meant it could go places regular tractors would just sink or get stuck. It had an engine with somewhere between 15 and 20 horsepower, which was actually pretty solid for its time. The problem was it was really heavy, like seriously heavy. That made it harder to move around, and if it ever got stuck, good luck getting it out. Still, the Steel Mule was advertised like crazy after World War I. One ad even called it the most efficient tractor in America. That might have been a stretch, but it definitely earned a spot in tractor history. But wait till you see a garden tractor that turns sharper than your shopping cart. 17. David Bradley Tri-Track. The David Bradley Tri-Track was a small garden tractor from the 1950s, and yeah, it was super weird, but also kind of genius. It was made for Sears by the David Bradley Manufacturing Company in Illinois, and it looked like a mix between a riding mower and a sci-fi robot. The driver sat on top and basically straddled the narrow body, kind of like riding a bike, but with 3 wheels. What made the Tri-Track different was how it steered. Most small tractors or mowers just turn the front wheels, right? Not this one. It had a special hinge in the middle of the frame that let all 3 wheels steer at once. This center articulated design meant it could turn really sharply, like within an 8-foot circle. That's tiny for a tractor. It had 1 powered wheel in the front and 2 wheels at the back. Because the whole chassis could flex and bend in the middle, it didn't need a regular differential like most tractors have. That made it lighter and cheaper, which was perfect for homeowners or small farms that didn't need a huge machine. Even though it was clever, it didn't become super popular. It stayed kind of a niche product and was only made for a short time. Which one was your favorite? Or have you seen something even crazier? Let us know in the comments.